I'll continue some more memories of Erie and the time we spent there. We had some problems with our in-laws. I might as well talk about it. Uh, the wedding went off well. There wasn't any flare-ups or uh, arguments or discussions or anything. We got a nice wedding present from Ray and Mill. It was a kitchen table and 4 chairs. And in those days, chrome was high on the preferred list. So the table had chrome edge on it, and chairs had chrome bars on the supporting members. And it was an expensive set. It cost $100, which today's terms is probably 600 or 700 anyway. And it was an expensive set. And it was a nice set too. Unfortunately, our kitchen was very small, and we only had a small amount of space. And as I mentioned earlier, the prior uh, resident there had this porcelain top fold-up kitchen table, which this picture shows. It's just maybe 2 feet wide and say 4 or 5 feet long, and he had 4 chairs, and that fitted perfectly in that kitchen. It allowed space to work in the kitchen, and yet could be expanded as necessary, which I'd paid somewhere between $10 and $15 for. It was in perfect condition. And of course, we only had 2 bedrooms, one that Shirley and I used, and one for storage and future use for mom and dad to sleep in, and others, well, babies too. So we really had no place for that set in our house. So I called Mill, Shirley's mother, and I asked her if it'd be all right if we exchanged it for something that we could use, something perhaps for the living room or something. And she went ballistic. Really totally unreasonable attitude and nasty response. She said, use that other bedroom as a dining room, and no, you can't take it back. And but of course we didn't want to use that bedroom as a dining room, which we needed like another bit of well, we didn't want to use the bedroom as a dining room. And so I waited a week or so, and it was still stacked in the house there, and I called her again, and I asked her, if I was very, I thought I was very humble in my request, but the explosion was even worse this time. So I told her, I said, well, Mill, I'm just going to put it out in the backyard then, because we don't have any space for it. And oh boy, so she hung up, and in a few days the store truck came out and picked it up. But there was another event that really soured our relationship for the next 7 years. And that was a visit that we made to their house one day. It was we were up in that region, and we decided to stop by and see how things were going and everything. Just visiting her parents. There's nothing formal about that. Well, Ray wasn't at home. He'd gone to the store or something, and Mill was there, and Shirley was pregnant then. This is several months after we got married. I think she's going through change of life, because she was just extremely irrational. And I'm not going to relate what happened, but we escaped, and we made up our mind that we just couldn't risk going back there again because of the unpredictable nature that she was exhibiting. So we then didn't visit until the time when our move date to Louisville was firm, which was New Year's Day, 1957. We just never visited or anything, and I hated to leave Erie with that feeling and that animosity, but we were both afraid of her, actually. From the things she said and did on that last visit, really gave us a serious reason to be concerned for Shirley's safety. But Shirley and I decided to try to patch things up before we left. So I wrote her a postcard. I wrote them a postcard and invited them out on the Sunday before New Year's. I think New Year's was on a Monday or a Tuesday that year. Nevertheless, I invited them out the day or so before we left, and they came out, and so we just resolved the animosity, and of course, knowing that we were going to Louisville and we would be safe there from any threats or of harm or anything like that, we felt comfortable in doing that. But as it turns out, they visited us in Louisville, and things were on a normal keel from there on. But you know, we went that 7 years, and we had those 3 kids, and they never saw them or visited, and I know that really hurt Ray more than Mill, I believe. But it was just really a sad situation. But I didn't know what else to do, and Shirley was in agreement that she didn't want them out there either. She didn't want to take any risks. But anyway, things after that were fine. We left our kids with them while we went on a trip to the West in 1964. We weren't married very long before Shirley began to have her way with the idea of having 10 kids. So by the fall of 1950, we knew that she was going to have Mark, our first one, and he was born on Flag Day in June 14th, 1951. And I remember being very possessive and proud of what Shirley and I had produced. And Shirley's Shirley's godmother came to visit us. They lived in Ohio, and they came to Erie, and of course she wanted to see Mark, and they came out to visit us. And Mark was lying on the changing table there, and she leaned over and kissed him right on the mouth. And oh, that infuriated me no end. I was certain that Mark was going to get hydrophobia or some horrible disease from that unsanitary. He survived all right, obviously. The fact that we hadn't been married a year before his birth invoked a clause in the hospitalization. I didn't get paid anything for whatever he had cost me, the doctor's bills and the hospitalization and so forth, and that amounted to about $300, I remember, and we had to pay that out of our own tiny surplus. It really was a big stretch to do it, but we did it. And of course the kids after that were all covered, but they had that year's waiting clause in there, and it affected us. Then it wasn't long before Shirley was pregnant again with Lucille, and she was born on the same day, just a year later than Mark, Flag Day, June 14th, 1952. So Shirley had her first 2 right before we were married 2 years. And then for some reason there was a gap in the production schedule, and I really don't know how many years gap there is between Lucille and Annette, just 2 or 3 maybe. In 1956, I believe, Annette was born, so that would make it about 4 years. I don't think it's quite that long, but anyway, there was a space there that Shirley didn't get pregnant. But I remember the day Annette was born. It was in January. It was cold, and Shirley told me that she needed to go to the hospital as her water had broken. So I put her in the car and we started toward the hospital, which was right in the downtown area of Erie. And so we're driving along 8th Street, heading east toward town, and we came to a stoplight. And I looked in the rearview mirror, and I saw this car coming, and I saw a woman driving, and she was looking out the side window of her car, and she hadn't started to slow down yet. And of course we were stopped, and I was behind a couple of cars at that stoplight. So when I saw that what was going to happen, I gunned the car and went up on the sidewalk and got out of her way just in time before she crashed into the car ahead of me. It was a miracle that I was able to do that, because it didn't take long for Shirley to deliver Annette when we got to the hospital. I remember that when Lucille was born and Shirley was discharged from the hospital, and we had been home for a few days, and we decided to go down to Frenchville. My mother was really hot to see Lucille, and of course Shirley was hot to show her off. But we didn't want to drive down there without Lucille being baptized. So we drove over to the church or parish house there, and I remember going, knocking at the door, and the housekeeper answered the door, and she said, she invited me in, and took me into the living room where Father was sitting, and I told him that we wanted to go on a trip, and that we'd like to have her baptized before we left. And unfortunately he was drunk, and he really was nasty. So don't bother me with that kind of stuff and all that. So I was really disappointed. But we were determined not to drive down, take the risk of having an accident without her being baptized. So the next day we drove over to the adjoining parish, and I asked the priest if he would baptize her, and he did it right away. I mean, it wasn't any. He was pleased to do it. So we made a successful and safe trip to Frenchville. The house across the driveway from us was a carbon copy of ours, and there was an older couple that lived there. Well, they were middle-aged, certainly not anciently old. But the woman, Stasa was her name, Stasa Amsbaugh. She was a excitable, enthusiastic kind of a person. And of course, when Annette was born, she really tried to, she wanted to be with Annette as much as she could. She was really liked Annette. Our houses were identical, and they had each a large picture window in the living room. And these windows were directly opposite this 20 or 25 foot driveway between us. And so I saw Stacia looking out her window one morning, and I went in and quickly grabbed Annette, and I held Annette up by one foot in front of the window, upside down. Oh boy, yeah. She just about tore the house down getting over there, and she didn't want Annette to be treated that way. But I guess it didn't do any harm to Annette, but I thought it was pretty funny. We had a whole spate of, we had 3 broken collarbones within probably 6 weeks. There were 2 steps leading up into the kitchen from that pad that I had poured in the back there. And Lucille came out and fell down off of one of those stairs and broke her right collarbone. So we took her to the doctor. There was a doctor living across the street from us. And I took her right over there, and he taped her arm to her body and encased her in half a mile of adhesive tape. And of course it really held her arm and shoulder immobile. But he said, "Nah, she'll be all right now, no problem." Well, we didn't know anything, and few days went by, and a week, and we didn't know when to take that off, but started to be concerned about it after a few days, and didn't know what to do. And I was watching it pretty carefully, and then when we smelled something, didn't smell good. So I cut the tape loose. I removed all that tape from her, and where her arm had been against her stomach, infection had set in between the contact area of the skin, and she had a nasty infection there. We took her to another doctor, and he looked at it, and he couldn't believe that the way she had been treated. So he put her arm in a sling and treated the infection. It didn't have any repercussions, but the treatment was really, it's really hard to understand. So she was doing all right. She was running around with a sling. And one day I was down in the basement, and Mark came down the basement stairs, and he fell off the last 2 or 3 steps and hit the concrete floor with a pop. I heard the bone break, and he broke his right collarbone. So that time we knew what to do, and he got him sling. The doctor prescribed a sling, and healed fine. But before he was done, Lucille, of course, had already healed hers, and she fell and broke her left one. So the same doctor treated her too. I began to get concerned that I was going to get accused of child abuse or something. During the time we lived in Erie, Shirley kept her activities, social activities with her girlfriends going. When she was young, and I can't tell you how old, maybe early teens certainly, she and about 7 or 8 other girls her age formed what they called the club, and they met frequently, maybe twice a month, or I know it wasn't every week, but frequently, to do various entertainment things. And one of the main things was to play bridge. It's, if you're not familiar with that game, it's a very technical game. It's similar to the 500 that my parents played, but it's different. But it still requires skill and knowledge of the rules and so forth. But anyway, they met, well, as I said, maybe bi-weekly or monthly, whatever. I don't recall how often, but at somebody's house, and they rotated, and they had some beverages and so forth. But they really had a good time. Those girls stayed together through their entire lives, and they're all dead now. Every one of those girls and their husbands are all gone. I'm the last one of that group that's still living. Shirley was always active. She liked to climb rocks there in a park that was nearby. I have some pictures of her. And she was always an athletic and curious and alert and always willing to try something new. And they played ball, and well, they were, as a whole, those girls in that group were pretty unique in the physical and mental activities that they did. They were all pretty smart girls. I got to know them all over the years, and there wasn't a dummy in the bunch. But I got the best one. I really did. I got the best looking one. Well, my landlord, Bill Burns, as I mentioned, had built these 4 houses there, and they were all cement block, all 4 of them. But he came across a big truckload or 2 of rocks that he decided he wanted to put a rock facade on the 2 front ones to probably appease the neighbors a little bit and kick the level of acceptability up a notch or 2. And this picture shows a portion of that house in the front on the right as you enter the driveway. he did both front houses. But of course, he needed a foundation to begin the walls from. So I was employed as the human steam shovel, as he called me, to dig a 4 foot deep footer trench around the houses so that he could pour a footer there and then begin the construction. And the ground there was all sand, basically, and it was very easy digging. So I used a coal shovel to dig that. It's a wide scoop-like shovel to move the dirt. It was a lot quicker than a spade-type shovel, and it was very possible to do that. So I was able to do both houses in a few days of pretty strenuous work, but still, it was pretty swiftly done, and he was really amazed at how quickly I was able to do that. But it was a lot like shoveling coal or any other fairly loose material. And I had plenty of time during my early years as a coal shoveler there at home, and so I knew how to do it. He was really he was an Irish guy, and he was really a character. He lived in a nice house across the street from our grouping there, and I remember another time at Christmas, he had bought the house, a large house, in a lot adjacent to this four house lot that he had, and they moved into this much larger and much nicer house, and it was Christmas time, and they had already set the Christmas tree up in their original house. And I remember seeing him. He grabbed the tree by the butt, and he got through the front door with it. He knocked off a lot of stuff, but I watched him walk down the street holding this really large Christmas tree, and it was fully decorated. He walked down the street, and the icicles and stuff were dropping off of it, and he carried it over to his new house. Oh, his wife was really mad at him. She was a character in her own right, but they didn't get along too well, and he was always doing something unique and unusual that she never approved of. But it was funny to see him walking down the street with all this stuff streaming off of the tree. He had on his new lot, he had some poplar trees that were immense. I don't remember the diameter at the butt, but it must have been 30 inches at least, maybe more. Beautiful, huge poplars. And there was one, though, that he wanted to cut down, and I don't know why, but I had started a night school then, and I was taking trigonometry, and he asked me to calculate the height of that tree and whether it would hit the house if it fell. So I did. I measured away from the butt of the tree 30 feet or whatever it was, and then got triangulated to the top of it, and I told him it probably would hit the house. The top of it would strike if it fell that direction. So he got a friend with a bulldozer, and they climbed up the tree a distance and attached a cable to the tree, and then the bulldozer pulled on the tree while it was being cut. But the tree fell toward the bulldozer all right, in the right direction. But in those days, the bulldozer transmissions didn't have a synchromesh in them, and they had to stop in order to change gears. Well, the tree started to fall, and the bulldozer was moving too slowly, and the driver had to stop to change gears, and it was a lost cause because the tree fell right next to the bulldozer and just missed the driver. I mean, he would have been a dead man if that tree would have fallen on the bulldozer and him both. It was a pretty scary situation, but the tree came down in a safe spot anyway and didn't hit the house. It was a good neighborhood there. It was an older neighborhood, but the people there treated us friendly. There was a couple that lived two lots up. They were older, And we didn't know them very well, but the woman was, and Shirley got along well. And then, of course, when we had Mark, that, baby's always interesting to women. But her husband committed suicide while we were there. And he got in his car and gassed himself to death. It was really a terrible thing. I used to work on cars. I put an ad in the GE News for brake jobs, $15. It cost me $7 for the parts, and I made $8 on it. It was, most of the time I had to go and get the car, so leave my car there while I did the work, and then I'd return it. But I made, it sounds like a very minor amount now, but it was probably equivalent of $50 today, which was still a good deal for the customer, but it helped. Every bit helped. I have a picture of me changing a clutch in a 41 Buick, and it was a big job. To do that, you had to disconnect the whole differential and springs and brakes and everything, and roll the rear wheels back to clear the transmission, so you could pull the transmission out of it. Fords were built the same way. They had an enclosed drive shaft that made that necessary. And for $5, I did that job. It took several hours to do. It was a big job. Of course, I had to lift the transmission out and put it back in, and those transmissions were heavy. The way I did it was to jack the car up a foot or two off the ground, enough to clear the transmission with it on my stomach, and I'd crawl under it and pull the transmission up I'd lay on my back underneath it and pull the transmission up onto my chest and stomach, and then I'd arch my back and jack the transmission up into position, and then that way I could use my arms to push it into the engine mounting position and get a couple bolts started. They were all cast iron and they were heavy. I know one time I was working on an Olds 88, and they had a V8 engine in them, and they were pretty hot, and I was tuning it up, putting new spark plugs and points in them, and that was required about every 8,000 or 10,000 miles. The lead in the gasoline fouled the spark plugs pretty badly, and so they needed to be changed. And I had done the job. I had changed the plugs and everything, and I was leaning over the side of the car underneath the hood, and I was adjusting the carburetor, and the transmission somehow fell into gear. And of course it was a worn car, and the linkage and everything I suppose was worn out, but anyway it dropped into gear while I was leaning over the hood, or under the hood, and it started to move forward, and there was a drop from the end of the concrete pad that was behind the house there, kind of a pad that actually I had poured for the landlord, and acted as a patio. And as the car moved forward, the front wheels fell off of the pad, and the frame then scraped, it just stopped the car from moving forward. But there was a tree close by the edge of the pad there, and I couldn't get out from under it, and it squeezed me between the tree and the pad. Unfortunately, it just tore my pants, but if it had been any closer, I'd have really suffered some serious physical damage. This view shows the pad, and you can see the tree. It wasn't a large tree, maybe 6 inches at the butt, but it was pretty strong, and that's what I got pinched against. But that didn't scare me as much as the fact that not 15 feet away was a house of our neighbors in the next lot, and the cement block foundation was dead ahead of the car, and when the car stopped, I guess maybe there was 10 feet of clearance between the car and that basement wall. And if it would hit that wall, it would have knocked it in and, well, been serious damage, that's for sure. It was a scary incident. I had another one, fell off a jack. Unfortunately, I was working on the rear wheel and the car came down and my knees knocked the chrome trim from the side of the fender, but it didn't really hurt me, but it was kind of a dangerous business. I didn't have the proper tools for any of that stuff, and that's the way it was. I changed the rear end in a Ford one time in the snow out there for $5, and I had to unhook the spring and the brakes, and it was miserable weather, but we scraped by. I advertised regularly in GE News, and it brought quite a few brake jobs and tune-ups. I did, well, I don't know how many over the couple of years that I was able to advertise. The company stopped that capability or that service, so it ended my brake job career. But during the couple of years that I did that, I probably did maybe 100 of them. I don't really know now, but it was fairly busy. Well, it was a bargain price to get a brake job for $15. But I had a incident with my own 41 Mercury. One morning we were getting ready to go to church, and of course I didn't have a garage, so I warmed the car up before we'd leave. And I went outside, and it had snowed several inches, and it was pretty wet snow and slippery. I got in the car, and I, of course, normally pressed on the clutch to free the transmission before I started. So I stepped in the car and immediately turned the key on and started the car. Of course, those Ford products always started instantly, so they were known for their quick starting regardless of the weather. But anyway, mine started right up, and at the same time, of course, I had parked it in gear, but at the same time it started, my foot slipped off the clutch just as I was pulling it out of gear, and it caught a piece of the teeth on a couple of gears and broke them off. Broken it off the low gear and then reverse sliding gear, and the cluster gear at the bottom, similar to what I repaired in Dad's Plymouth back in the earlier days of my life. So and I didn't have very many tools, just rudimentary tools, and so I took it to the garage, and they wanted $100 to fix it, and that was a monstrous price. I didn't have it, so I decided I could do it myself. So I did. I jacked it up and did pulled the transmission out. I had to take the back spring off, just like all the other Fords, and the brakes and everything. And I bought new gears for it, which were probably $15 or so. They were really pretty inexpensive. And I repaired it and got it back running. And a couple weeks later, it had snowed. Of course, it snowed frequently in Erie, but it's hard to believe, but I did the same stupid thing again. I broke my new gears by the same exact repetition of the first one. Well, this time I decided that, of course, I was going to fix it myself, but I wasn't going to do it with the pliers and screwdriver and a few tools that I had. So I went to Sears, and I bought a set of half-inch drive socket wrenches and a set of box end wrenches and maybe a couple other things, but those were the two key items that I really needed. And of course, having just done it, everything was extremely fresh in my mind. And so I repeated the process on that thing again. But boy, that was sure aggravating the second time. It was bad enough the first time. I even painted a couple of cars back there. Sears had a gimmick that was called Padolac, and I saw a demonstration there at Sears one time, and this guy was painting a car with this new invention. So he didn't do a bad job with it, so I bought a kit to do this car, and consisted of a can of paint with a spring-loaded strainer like in the can, and you got a big mitt, like a fleece mitt, and you put your hand on that spring loaded screen and press it down into the paint, and it controlled the amount of paint more or less that you got on your mitt, and then you'd wipe that mitt over the region of the car and spread it out. And well, it didn't turn out like the guy in the demo was doing, but at least it was all one color. I did that twice, but it was a very bad looking job in my opinion, and so I never did that again. But I did some body work too, pounded out a few fenders, and I did straighten a bumper one time, and whatever would generate a few bucks, I tackle it. But it was all some important help to our means of living for the next day. Well, Shirley quit her little job immediately upon our marriage, and but I had well, there was something about my wife working that I didn't care for, although she did work a month or so after we were married. But when she became pregnant, that was the end of that kind of work for her. And later in life, when the kids were all gone, she drove a school bus for a year before we moved from Louisville to Frankfort, and she was good at it. I saw her park that thing between other buses with just a couple of feet to spare on each side, and she zipped that thing right in there like she'd been doing it all her life. And then in Frankfurt, she took a job as a secretary for a state government there that was in control of radiation detectors that the government had scattered all around the state, and this little business that the state had was involved with maintenance of those things. There were only 2 or 3 people in that group, and Shirley, so she worked there about a year before we transferred to Dawson Springs. So she never earned enough to generate Social Security eligibility, but that was all right. She had a handful at home. She didn't have time to do outside work, and that was her place anyway. I thought it was kind of demeaning if I couldn't support my own family without having to have her out digging the ditches to help. I realized that working on the assembly line was not going to provide a very good life for Shirley and I. And she kept talking about having 10 kids, and I said, oh my gosh. So that's when I elected to move to the machine shop there in the locomotive section and start night school. But that was a 4-year program, and even though I made better money in the locomotive section, it still wasn't adequate. And it just happened that we had a retired guy from GE living in one of the houses on our lot there, and he was I think he was probably an engineer, but he built garages after his retirement, and so he hired me as a helper in building garages. And this helper really meant that I dug the footers for the basement, for the cement floors, which had to be about 18 inches deep in order to escape the frost levels there. And even that wasn't deep enough, but 18 inches was deep enough to prevent damage and heaving of the floor. So that's the kind of work I started doing. And of course, uh, I tried to do some carpentry work, but he he told me, he says, "You're never even going to make a rough carpenter." You know, and he was right. I didn't know how to use a skill saw or but I knew how to use a handsaw and a hammer and that type of thing because I was accustomed to that at home. But he was very dubious about letting me do anything that required any precision work. But I did do the nailing, and one of the faults that he had was he'd get a contract for a garage, and he kept busy. He always had contracts, it seemed. But we'd get a garage started, maybe pour the floor or do something, get it started, and then we'd start on the next contract without finishing the first one. And so there might be two or three garages partially finished, but all started. And of course that ticked the customers off because it might be a month before we'd come back to do any work, and then we'd maybe frame it up and then leave it sit while we went to another one. And so it took several months, maybe 4, 5, 6 months before the first customer's garage was finished. And you know, there was never any pleasant relationships with the customers because they were all ticked at having the situation being partially done. I know one time we'd started one in the fall, and we'd tinkered with it and diddled with it, and New Year's rolled around and we had the roof sheathed, but we didn't have the shingles on the roof. And this owner went to court, and the judge told him to finish it forthwith. So New Year's Day, he had promised to put the roof on by New Year's Day. Well, New Year's Day came and the roof still wasn't even started, but he was obligated without to get it, at least get it started. So he told me to go out there and put that roof on this garage, and it was a bitter cold day. And if you've ever lived in Pennsylvania, you know that the wind from in Erie especially, the wind would blow off the lake, and this garage was built on a higher level than the city itself. It was on the outskirts a little bit on a hill to the south, and so I could see the lake very easily from the top of this garage. But the garage was covered with ice and snow, and so I had to take a shovel and scrape the snow and stuff off the roof before I could even start. And fortunately the slope wasn't too steep that I couldn't keep a grip on the roof. But the shingles themselves are like pieces of glass. And when I tried to drive a nail, the asphalt shingle would actually break off. And of course I was trying to drive nails with gloves because it was so cold. And I'd nail my glove to the roof and then have to pull a nail out. I got a row or two started on there, and I knew how to do that, so it wasn't a totally stupid person trying to put it on, but the weather conditions were just, it was just not the day to put a roof on. Finally the woman came out and she said, "Oh, go home." She said, "I can't stand to see you out there in that weather." So I took her up on it and left. But he was a character. His first wife had died maybe 10 years before that, and he was 68 or 70 years old, and he had remarried a younger woman, and he was a tough old bird. But we gradually bought furniture as we needed it, and toward the end of our time there, we actually bought a TV, a Philco TV. I didn't want a TV while I was going to night school, and I couldn't afford it anyway. So I didn't have a TV all the 4 years that I went to night school. But when I graduated, I got into off of the hourly ranks into salary, and I got a raise, so we bought a TV. And this TV was known as they advertised a deep dimension. I'll never forget that. And the thing We had it a couple of weeks and it just quit working, so I took it back to the store, and I remember that the selenium rectifiers had burned out. They were two big winding things in there, electrical part of the circuit, of the part of the electrical circuit, and they had both burned out. So they replaced them. But it wasn't long before tubes started to burn out, and I know the warranty was only for maybe 6 months or something. You know, it wasn't an extended warranty, so it was up to me to get it fixed. And of course, taking it to a TV repair shop was going to cost $10 or $15 anyway. So I took the tubes out, and in those days, the drugstores had a TV tube tester. It was a machine that, well, it was about the size of a washing machine, and you plugged your tubes in to the right socket, and the dials would tell you whether the thing was any good or not. So I took all the tubes out and took them over there, and sure enough, there were a couple tubes bad, and they sold the tubes right there in the drugstore. And that's why they had the tester too, so that they could have the TV tube business with it. So there were two tubes, and I remember the numbers of one of them, 6SN7. That tube caused the failure in that tube caused the picture to flip vertically. It would flip up every few seconds. It would flip up and then stop, and you could see it, and then it would flip up again. And oh, it was just aggravating as the dickens to try to watch it. And during the years we had that TV, I replaced almost 100 tubes in it, and most of them were 6SN7s and another one that I don't remember the name of or the numeral designation for today. But that was a hard TV to like. Well, when we moved from Erie, I left the thing there and threw it away. It was just too much to try to keep up. I'm going to stop this one here.